Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to look at how to purify the emotional center as understood within the fourth way, a path of inner development that uses everyday life to cultivate self-awareness and awaken beyond mechanical habits. To begin understanding this, we shall first look at a statement by Maurice Nicoll, one of the most prominent students of Gurdjieff, the philosopher and spiritual teacher who founded the fourth way system. The statement is as follows: you have the right not to be negative. This is not a command, but a statement about our condition. The proposition is that negativity is a choice, and that the habitual negative emotions that we experience are a product of what, in the fourth way, is called wrong work of the emotional center. In the fourth way, centers are the basic parts of the human makeup. Each center is responsible for a specific kind of functioning. They are not physical organs, but rather functional divisions of energy and attention. Functional divisions of energy and attention means that each center in a person uses energy in its own way and focuses on a specific kind of activity: thinking, feeling, moving, or regulating the body, each with its own speed, needs, and way of working. To begin understanding this important work, one must first see the emotional center not as a static part of the personality, but as a dynamic mechanism that either obstructs or supports inner development. It is the most reactive, the fastest, and often the most misunderstood part of a person. Left unexamined, it becomes the strongest chain-binding one to mechanical life. Purifying it is not a matter of improvement by modern therapeutic standards, nor a shift toward emotional positivity. It is an exact process of letting go, unlearning, and relearning. Before we move on, an important clarification is in order, as this can be a source of confusion. Not all intense emotional states are negative emotions, as they are understood within the fourth way system. What is meant by this will become clearer as the video progresses. The fourth way draws a clear distinction between mechanical reactions and real emotional experience. Grief, for example, when arising from real loss, is not considered negative in itself. It becomes negative only when it is prolonged through identification and imagination. When one spins stories around it, or uses it to reinforce a personal narrative. The same applies to anger. In itself, anger is not negative. However, what is often called righteous anger is rarely free from admixtures like vanity, pride, or inner accounts. According to the teaching, it is not the presence of strong emotion that is the problem, but the contamination of that emotion with identification. Real feeling, when it is clean, direct, and uncolored by the mechanical parts of the personality, belongs to a different order. It does not reinforce unconsciousness. On the contrary, it can even serve awakening if it is observed and allowed to pass without feeding it with the mind's habitual chatter. Now, the fourth way teaches that the ordinary state of human life is unconscious. Human beings in their ordinary state are like machines. This is not a judgment, but an observable fact, and it will not change simply by one becoming aware of it, even if this is a crucial first step. If you observe carefully in yourself and in others, it becomes clear that what most call action is almost always reaction. One lives in chains of habitual responses, with little real awareness between cause and effect. Even when one begins to wake up to this, it happens within a system that still operates mechanically. This is especially true in the emotional center. What is usually taken to be emotion is often a mixture of associations, inner talking, imagined scenarios, and bodily reactions, shaped more by the intellectual center than by direct feeling. Thought interferes with feeling, labels it, justifies it, and in doing so, distorts it. Emotional reactions are not simply felt, they are constructed. Because of this, the emotional center does not operate freely. It becomes entangled in narratives, self-images, and memory. The fourth way refers to this condition as contamination, and the most damaging form of it is negative emotion. These reactions arise not from clarity, but from identification, inner accounts, and habitual postures. They are not necessary. They are mechanical, and they block the emotional center from receiving anything higher. To purify the emotional center means to remove the presence and the influence of negative emotions. Not some of them, not most of them, but all of them. This sounds impossible at first because negative emotion is often seen as natural, justified, or even honest. But the fourth way makes it clear that there is no such thing as a necessary negative emotion. They serve no function in inner growth. On the contrary, they shut the door to higher emotional states. They block conscience. They consume energy. They prevent the formation of a real I. Negative emotion does not arise suddenly. What appears to be a spontaneous reaction is often the final link in a long chain of identification, self-pity, inner accounting, or resentment. Much of it happens beneath the surface, through accumulated impressions that were not digested consciously. Negative emotions are the discharge of this accumulation. They do not reflect the world, they reflect the internal disorder. This is why the first condition for emotional purification is to begin observing negative emotion as it arises, not as something happening to you, but as something moving within the machine. One must see the emotion, not be the emotion, not identify with it. Imagine, for example, that you pass someone you know, perhaps in the hallway at work or on the street, and they don't greet you. They look away, or their expression is neutral. Almost immediately, a reaction begins. You start thinking, they're ignoring me. Did I do something wrong? Maybe they're angry with me. Then, perhaps, they always act superior. I never really liked the way they treated me. What could have been a passing ambiguous moment becomes a source of irritation or self-doubt. This is how negative emotion arises. The event itself is neutral. But imagination fills in the blanks, memory supplies old material, and identification takes hold. The emotional reaction deepens, not because of what actually happened, but because of how the machine interprets it. Without observation, this reaction becomes a closed loop. Energy is spent, mood is altered, and attention is lost. All of it happens automatically. You are encouraged to find your own examples of this, as this is necessary if you want to truly understand it. The word automatically is key here. If you observe yourself carefully in a similar situation, you will notice that these thoughts just happen. They just give off the illusion of intentionality. And soon the thoughts give rise to more emotions, which in turn give rise to more thoughts, until you become aware of what is going on, or something happens that breaks the loop. In the early stages, this observation can be extremely difficult. The sense of I is usually mixed into the emotional reaction. When there is irritation, one says, I am irritated. When there is anxiety, one says, I am anxious. But this is already an error. The fourth way insists that one must begin to divide oneself, not with artificial distancing or denial, but by bringing attention to what is happening inside, as a process, not as an identity. Instead of saying, I am angry, it is more accurate to see anger arising in the machine. This inner separation is essential. Without it, the whole system collapses into identification. The emotional center is then flooded, and one is entirely lost inside the experience. This process of inner division requires effort, but not a straining effort. It is not willpower in the ordinary sense. It is attention. It is the placement of consciousness. When one begins to watch the process without immediately believing it, a new space becomes available. In that space, negative emotion can no longer dominate in the same way. Its power is weakened. Its hold is loosened. This is the beginning of purification. There is no purification without recognition of the subtle pleasure one sometimes takes in negativity. The fourth way teaches that many emotional states, even those that feel unpleasant, have a hidden attraction. They feed something in us that wants to be right, that wants to be the center, that wants to blame. This includes anger, self-pity, resentment, wounded vanity, jealousy, and even depression. These states begin as reactions to events, but they are fed and sustained internally, sometimes for years after the initial event that triggered them. Sometimes they shape the rest of one's life. They become habits of emotional posture. Over time, they shape perception. They become invisible until they are seen through conscious effort. To purify the emotional center means to refuse the false nourishment these states offer. It means recognizing their cost. Negative emotions are not only wasteful, they are deeply destructive. They burn energy, they erode inner coherence, and they make it impossible to receive influence from the higher centers. The fourth way teaches that the higher emotional center already exists in every human being, fully developed but not accessible. The door to it is closed by negative emotion. The emotional center, when cleansed of these reactions, becomes the channel through which higher influence flows. The higher centers are parts that are already fully formed, but they are out of reach under ordinary conditions. There are higher emotional, intellectual, and moving centers. Here we are mainly dealing with the emotional and intellectual centers, even if the moving center can be used in the purification of the emotional center as well. These higher centers function on a level of clarity, presence, and understanding that is completely different from the lower centers we normally live through. They do not work through effort, analysis, or intensity. They work through direct perception. When the emotional center becomes quiet, receptive, and free from mechanical reactions, it can begin to receive impressions from these higher parts. These are not visions or mystical experiences in the way many imagine them, but moments of insight, stillness, or deep feeling that have no opposite. They are rare, and they cannot be summoned. But the conditions for them can be prepared. Emotional purification is that preparation. One of the main difficulties in this work is that most people have never experienced the emotional center functioning in a pure state. They confuse emotional intensity with emotional truth. They confuse sincerity with expression. But the fourth way draws a clear line. Mechanical emotion has nothing to do with conscious feeling. In fact, the more intense the identification, the less room there is for real emotion to arise. The emotional center, once cleansed, becomes capable of something entirely different. It can begin to receive impressions directly. In ordinary life, impressions are filtered through thought, through past associations, through unconscious reactions. But a purified emotional center perceives more immediately. It feels without distortion. This is what makes it the true instrument of conscience. Conscience, in fourth way terms, is not morality or guilt. It is the capacity to feel the truth of a situation without interference. It is one of the highest functions available to the human structure, but it cannot manifest through a contaminated emotional center. In fact, negative emotion drowns the voice of conscience almost immediately. When one is caught in a reactive state, one cannot hear the quiet clarity that conscience brings. One is ruled by justification and defense. To move toward the emotional purification necessary for conscience to function, a person must practice a specific kind of sincerity. Not emotional confession, but honesty in observation. One must see the emotional patterns as they are, without embellishment and without condemnation. This neutral observation allows something in us to stand apart, and only from this standing apart can change begin. Another principle of the fourth way is that negative emotion creates internal accounts. When you feel wronged, misunderstood, or rejected, part of you keeps a record. These internal accounts accumulate, and with them, a sense of grievance. Over time, this transforms the emotional center into something narrow and self-involved. The inner life becomes preoccupied with imagined debts and injuries. The emotional energy that could be used for development is instead consumed by the maintenance of this emotional bookkeeping. To purify the emotional center, these accounts must be seen and cancelled. In this, it is important to remember that the event itself and the memory of it may very well be real, but the emotionally fueled stories that our mind tells us about it are not. The grievances that we attach to the event, or that we keep alive and continue to fuel with emotions by ruminating over it, are not necessary. In other words, cancelling accounts does not mean forgetting or pretending nothing happened. It means seeing clearly the uselessness of holding on. Every moment of grievance reaffirms the false self and reinforces mechanicalness. Releasing these accounts without emotional drama is an act of inner freedom. It restores movement. It allows energy to return to the center in a new way. Forgiveness, in this context, is not a moral gesture. It is a technical necessity. You cannot purify the emotional center while carrying the weight of old identifications. You cannot awaken while dragging behind you the emotional residues of years of reactions. These must be observed, seen through, and released. Not once, but continuously. The fourth way also emphasizes that emotional purification is not only the removal of the negative, it also makes room for the emergence of positive emotion. But positive emotion, as defined in the system, is not the opposite of negative emotion. It does not belong to the duality of mood. It is not a matter of being cheerful, optimistic, or pleasant. Positive emotion appears only when the emotional center is functioning without distortion. It is marked by clarity, stillness, depth, and a kind of joy that has no opposite. It is stable. It does not depend on events. This kind of emotional experience cannot be reached directly. It appears as a byproduct of right inner work. It is not something one can will. It comes when conditions are prepared, and the main condition is the absence of negative emotions. As long as the emotional center is filled with reactions, projections, and justifications, there is no room for anything real. When justifying, one constantly feels that one's emotional reactions are valid. But the fourth way challenges this belief completely. It requires a kind of inner humiliation, a willingness to be wrong, to see that what one calls righteous anger or justified offense is still mechanical. It still belongs to sleep. Without this inner surrender, no purification is possible. Another key to the purification of the emotional center is the work on identification. We've touched upon it throughout the video, but it is an important topic that needs thorough clarification. Identification means being lost in a thought, a mood, a sensation, or an event. It means being taken. Negative emotion feeds on identification. One cannot be negative without being identified. So one of the most effective approaches to emotional purification is to study the moments of identification, to notice them as they happen, and consciously take a step back from them. With consistent effort, a person begins to experience emotional life differently. There is more space. There is less compulsion. The reactions still appear, but they no longer dominate. They are seen. They fade. And when they do, something lighter appears. Not necessarily an emotion in the usual sense, but a presence. A quietness that does not collapse under pressure. This is the sign that the emotional center is beginning to purify. None of this is quick. The purification of the emotional center is not a project for a week or a year. It is the long work of inner transformation. It requires patience, honesty, and continuity. It does not require forcing, but watching. Not suppressing, but understanding. The fourth way teaches that one must work at the level where one is. And the level where most of us begin is a state of emotional sleep. In summary, the fourth way teaches that the emotional center must be purified if real inner transformation is to take place. Most emotions are mechanical, shaped by identification and habit, and they keep us asleep. Negative emotions, in particular, block conscience, drain energy, and prevent access to higher centers. Purification does not mean suppression, but clear, sustained observation without justification or resistance. As negative emotions lose their hold, the emotional center becomes receptive, and higher emotions, stable, unchanging, and free from false personality, can begin to appear. The fourth way affirms that you have the right not to be negative, and through sincere effort and the loosening of identification, this right becomes real. Finally, seen clearly, the human condition is marked by dysfunction, confusion, fragmentation, and reactivity. As one studies the teachings of the fourth way, it becomes difficult to deny the extent to which perception is distorted, behavior automatic, and the inner life governed by forces one does not control. But this recognition is not meant to create despair. It is meant to create clarity. And with that clarity comes the possibility of change. Through simple acts of self-observation, through noticing rather than obeying reactions, and through remembering that you have the right not to be negative, something in you begins to shift. This means catching yourself in a moment of irritation and choosing not to feed it. It means seeing a familiar pattern begin and quietly stepping aside from it. These are small acts, but they create space. And in that space, something higher can begin to reach you. The emotional center, when no longer filled with noise and old habits, becomes available to another kind of experience, one that is stable, intelligent, and unshakable. It does not arrive through striving or belief, but through making room for it with new conscious mental habits. And for that, you begin exactly where you are. Not by fixing what you find, but by seeing it honestly and remembering that something deeper is possible. If you found the content of this video useful, we have a whole playlist with different videos on the fourth way teachings. Together with it, you will also find videos about how to release trapped negative emotional energy and how to reprogram the mind as taught by the spiritual teachers David R. Hawkins and Joe Dispenza, respectively. You've now reached the end of the video. Remember to like and subscribe. Thank you for your time.